The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the small two-bedroom house on Maple Street in Seattle's Rainier Valley neighborhood. 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez lay sprawled on the living room carpet, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders, as she carefully colored inside the lines of her favorite Disney princess coloring book. Belle's yellow dress was getting special attention tonight. Emma had decided it needed to be the exact shade of the sunflowers her father had planted in their tiny backyard garden last spring. "Mia, dinner will be ready in 10 minutes. Her father, Antonio, called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the warm accent that reminded Emma of their visits to her grandmother in Guadalajara. The familiar sounds of sizzling garlic and onions filled the air, mixing with the rich aroma of his famous spaghetti sauce, the recipe he'd learned from his own mother decades ago. Emma could hear him humming an old Mexican folk song as he stirred the pot, the same tune he sang every Tuesday when it was spaghetti night. Buddy, their 2-year-old golden retriever, dozed peacefully beside Emma, one massive paw draped protectively over her leg. His golden coat gleamed in the soft lamplight, and his gentle breathing created a rhythmic soundtrack to the cozy evening. Emma had begged for a dog since she could talk, and when Buddy arrived as a surprise for her 6th birthday, he'd instantly become her shadow, her confidant, and her best friend, all rolled into one furry package. The television murmured quietly in the background, some cooking show that her mother Maria enjoyed watching when she got home from her evening shift at the hospital. Maria worked as a nurse's aide, often pulling double shifts to help pay for Emma's piano lessons and the small extras that made their modest life feel rich with possibility. Tonight, she wouldn't be home until nearly midnight, leaving father and daughter to their cherished Tuesday tradition of spaghetti and Disney movies. Emma selected a purple crayon for Belle's book, completely absorbed in her artistic mission. She'd been working on this particular page for 3 days, determined to make it perfect. At school, her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had praised her attention to detail and suggested she might become an artist someday. The thought thrilled Emma. She'd already started drawing pictures of the house she wanted to live in when she grew up, complete with a garden full of sunflowers and a special room just for Buddy. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7:30, its deep tones echoing through their small home. Antonio had inherited the antique from his father, and despite Maria's complaints about the space it took up, he refused to part with it. "Time connects us to those we love," he'd tell Emma whenever she asked about the towering wooden timepiece. "This clock watched over my father, and now it watches over us." Outside, the October evening had settled into full darkness. Street lights flickered on automatically, casting long shadows between the modest homes that lined their quiet residential street. Mrs. Chun next door was walking her elderly Chihuahua, and Mr. Williams across the street was bringing in his garbage cans from the curb. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary evening that Emma would later remember as the last normal moment of her childhood. Buddy's ears suddenly perked up, his head lifting from the carpet with alert attention. His tail stopped its lazy swishing, and a low, almost inaudible whine escaped his throat. Emma paused her coloring, looking down at her faithful companion with curiosity. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears the way that usually calmed him. But Buddy's entire body had gone rigid, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the front window. His nostrils flared as he processed scents that his human family couldn't detect. Antonio's humming continued from the kitchen, punctuated by the cheerful clatter of plates being set on the counter. He was probably arranging their dinner, just the way Emma liked it. The spaghetti twirled into neat little nests, the sauce ladled carefully so it wouldn't splash, and a piece of garlic bread cut into triangles, because she'd once declared that triangles tasted better than rectangles. Returned to her coloring, but Buddy remained on high alert. His body was coiled like a spring, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Dogs possessed an ancient awareness that humans had long forgotten, an ability to sense danger before it revealed itself. In shelters and training facilities across the country, dogs like Buddy were being taught to channel these instincts into service, to protect, to comfort, to save lives. But Buddy was just a family pet, loved and loving, with no special training beyond basic obedience and an abundance of treats. The first crack in their perfect evening came at exactly 7:47 p.m. A shadow moved past the front window too quick, too furtive for a neighbor walking their dog. Buddy's growl rumbled deep in his chest, and he rose to his feet with fluid grace, positioning himself between Emma and the window. His hackles raised in a ridge of golden fur along his spine. "Buddy, what's wrong?" Emma asked, setting down her purple crayon. For the first time that evening, a flutter of unease stirred in her stomach. The shadow passed the window again, and this time Emma saw it too, the silhouette of someone moving along the side of their house, someone who didn't belong in their peaceful neighborhood on their safe street. Someone who was about to shatter their world into a million pieces, just like the window that would explode inward in exactly 30 seconds dot in the kitchen. Antonio continued humming, blissfully unaware that their last normal moment together was ticking away with each beat of Emma's rapidly accelerating heart. The grandfather clock prepared to chime again, but it would be drowned out by sounds that no child should ever hear. 3 months had passed since that horrific October night, but for Emma Rodriguez, time had stopped completely at 7:47 p.m. She sat in the sterile waiting room of Seattle Children's Hospital, her small fingers tracing invisible patterns on Buddy's golden coat while Dr. Rebecca Foster reviewed her case file for what felt like the 100th time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance across Emma's pale face, a face that hadn't spoken a single word since she watched her father die. Dr. Foster adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and studied the latest psychological evaluation. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, displayed classic symptoms of selective mutism triggered by severe trauma. Her mother, Maria, had tried everything: gentle coaxing, bribes with ice cream, even threats to take away her art supplies, but Emma remained locked in a prison of silence that no key seemed able to open. The only sounds she made were soft whimpers in her sleep, and the occasional gasp when unexpected noises startled her back to that terrible night. "Emma, can you show me what you drew today?" Dr. Foster asked, her voice carefully modulated to convey warmth without pressure. The child psychologist had spent 15 years working with traumatized children, but Emma's case was unlike anything she'd encountered. Most children eventually found small ways to communicate: a nod, a gesture, even angry outbursts. Emma simply existed in a bubble of profound silence, as if speaking might somehow make the nightmare real again. Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of construction paper covered in crayon markings. Dr. Foster's breath caught in her throat as she examined the drawing. Despite being created by a 7-year-old, the details were disturbingly accurate. A man in a dark hoodie with fierce eyes visible through the mask. A broken window with jagged glass scattered across the floor, and in the corner, a small figure cowering behind a golden dog. The proportions were perfect, the colors exactly right. Even the position of furniture in the Rodriguez living room was precisely rendered. "This is very good work, Emma," Dr. Foster said gently. "Can you tell me about the man in the picture?" Emma's grip tightened on Buddy's collar. The golden retriever, sensing her distress, pressed closer against her legs and fixed Dr. Foster with an almost human-like stare that seemed to say, "Don't push her too hard." In the months since the attack, Buddy had transformed from a playful family pet into something resembling a professional therapy animal. He anticipated Emma's needs, positioned himself between her and strangers, and somehow knew exactly when she needed his comforting presence most. Meanwhile, across town in the Jaffe. King County Police Department, Detective Sarah Martinez, was experiencing her own form of torture. The Antonio Rodriguez murder case sat on her desk like an accusation, its manila folder thick with evidence that should have guaranteed a conviction. They had fingerprints on the window frame, DNA evidence from blood left behind when the perpetrator cut himself on the broken glass, and security camera footage showing Marcus Thompson in the neighborhood just hours before the murder. But none of it mattered without Emma's testimony. Thompson was a career criminal with a rap sheet dating back to his teens breaking and entering, armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon. The 34-year-old had been released from state prison just 6 weeks before Antonio's murder, and his parole officer had lost track of him within days. When police arrested him at a downtown homeless shelter, cocaine residue was still under his fingernails, and he reeked of desperation and violence. But his public defender was sharp, and she'd already filed motions to exclude most of the physical evidence on technicalities. "The girl has to testify," Prosecutor Linda Chun had told Detective Martinez during their latest strategy meeting. Without her eyewitness account, Thompson walks. His lawyer will claim the physical evidence could belong to any number of intruders, and the jury might buy it. "We need Emma to identify him as the man who pulled that trigger." But how do you ask a traumatized 7-year-old to face her father's killer in open court when she hasn't spoken a word in 3 months? Dr. Foster had tried every technique in her considerable arsenal. Play therapy sessions where Emma could act out the trauma with dolls yielded nothing but broken toys and tears. Art therapy produced an endless stream of drawings, all featuring the same dark figure, the same broken window, the same golden dog standing guard. Hypnotherapy was deemed too risky for someone so young. Even bringing in a child psychiatrist to evaluate Emma for medication had proven fruitless when she refused to communicate her symptoms. The most heartbreaking part was watching Maria Rodriguez slowly crumble under the weight of her daughters. Silence. The single mother worked double shifts at the hospital, trying to pay for Emma's therapy while dealing with her own grief over losing Antonio. She'd lost weight, developed dark circles under her eyes, and started speaking to Emma in increasingly desperate tones. "Por favor, Mia," just one word, Maria would plead in Spanish during their evening sessions. "Tell Mama you love her. Tell me you're okay. Tell me anything." But Emma would only stare with those huge dark eyes that had seen too much, her hand inevitably finding Buddy's reassuring presence. The golden retriever had become more than Emma's comfort. He was her voice, her protector, and her connection to the world. When social workers suggested that having the dog present might be preventing Emma from processing her trauma properly, Maria had threatened to find new therapists. Buddy wasn't the problem. He was the only thing standing between Emma and complete psychological collapse. Detective Martinez knew they were running out of time. Thompson's trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks, and the defense was already arguing that a child who refused to speak was clearly incompetent to testify. The legal system had no patience for trauma that couldn't be quantified, measured, and scheduled according to court calendars. In the quiet therapy room, Dr. Foster watched Emma carefully color another picture, this one showing a courtroom with a small girl and a golden dog facing a judge. Perhaps, somewhere in her silence, Emma was preparing for what everyone knew had to come next. The question was whether she'd find her voice before justice slipped away forever. The mahogany doors of Judge Patricia Williams' chambers slammed shut with a thunderous crack that seemed to shake the very foundations of the King County Superior Court building. Defense attorney Robert Hayes stood with his feet planted wide, his expensive suit wrinkled from 3 sleepless nights of legal research, his normally pristine appearance betraying the desperation of a man watching his career-defining case slip away. "Absolutely not," Hayes exploded, his voice echoing off. the leather-bound law books that lined every wall. A therapy dog in my courtroom? Your Honor, this is a travesty of justice, not a trial. We might as well bring in a circus tent and some dancing bears while we're destroying centuries of legal precedent. Judge Patricia Williams, known throughout Washington state as the Iron Lady of criminal justice, sat behind her imposing desk with the stillness of a coiled spring. At 62, she had presided over more than 3,000 cases, from petty theft to capital murder, and her reputation for running the tightest courtroom in the Pacific Northwest was legendary. Lawyers often joked nervously that Judge Williams could silence a riot with a single raised eyebrow and had once held a disrupted courtroom in contempt for an entire afternoon until order was restored. But this case was testing even her legendary composure. Prosecutor Linda Chun stood at the opposite end of the chambers, her arms crossed and her jaw set in a line that suggested she was ready to fight this battle all the way to the Washington State Supreme Court, if necessary. Spread across the conference table between them lay Emma's drawings, dozens of them, each one more detailed and disturbing than the last. The 7-year-old had an artist's eye for detail and a trauma victim's perfect recall, creating what amounted to a visual testimony that was both heartbreaking and legally unprecedented. Your Honor, Chun said, her voice carefully controlled but trembling with barely contained passion. This child is our only witness to a cold-blooded murder. She identified Marcus Thompson in a photo lineup with 100% accuracy. Her drawings show details about the crime scene that only someone who was there could know. The position of her father's body, the exact pattern of the broken glass, even the specific Nike logo on the perpetrator's shoes details we never released to the media. Hayes scoffed, his face flushed with indignation. Drawings, Your Honor. We're talking about convicting a man of first-degree murder based on crayon drawings from a traumatized child who hasn't spoken in 3 months. And now the prosecution wants to parade this little girl into court with her emotional support animal, like some kind of performance designed to manipulate the jury's sympathies. That little girl watched her father die. Sean shot back, her professional composure cracking slightly. She's 7 years old, Mr. Hayes. 7. And according to every child psychologist who's examined her, she physically cannot testify without her therapy dog present. The trauma has created a selective mutism so severe that removing Buddy from her presence triggers panic attacks. Judge Williams had been listening to this argument for 2 hours, and her patience was wearing thin. She'd built her career on following the law to the letter, on maintaining order in her courtroom, and on ensuring that justice was served without bias or prejudice. But Emma Rodriguez's case was forcing her to confront questions that no law school had prepared her to answer. She picked up one of Emma's drawings, this one showing a small figure huddled behind a golden dog, while a dark figure loomed over a man collapsed on the floor. The artistic skill was remarkable for a child, but it was the emotional weight of the image that made Williams' chest tighten. In 30 years on the bench, she'd seen hundreds of crime scene photos, but none had affected her quite like this 7-year-old's crayon rendering of her father's final moments. Mr. Hayes, Judge Williams said finally, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had intimidated countless attorneys. What exactly are you proposing? That we simply let Mr. Thompson walk free, because our key witness is too traumatized to testify according to traditional protocols. Hayes straightened his tie, a nervous habit that betrayed his discomfort with the moral implications of his legal position. Your Honor, I'm proposing that we follow established legal precedent. Children's testimony is notoriously unreliable under the best circumstances. A child who refuses to speak, who communicates only through drawings, and who would require an emotional support animal to even enter the courtroom. The potential for prejudicing the jury is enormous. And what about the potential for letting a murderer go free? Chun interjected. Thompson has a history of violent crime. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, breaking and entering. He was released from state prison just 6 weeks before Antonio Rodriguez was killed. Are we really going to let legal technicalities prevent us from getting justice for a man who died protecting his home and his daughter? The chamber fell silent except for the steady tick of the antique clock on Williams' desk, a clock that had marked time through thousands of legal decisions, but never one quite like this. Outside, Seattle's February rain drummed against the tall windows, and somewhere in the courthouse below, Emma Rodriguez sat in a witness preparation room, drawing yet another picture, while Buddy kept his faithful vigil beside her. Judge Williams had built her reputation on precedent, on the careful application of established law, on maintaining the dignity and traditions of the American judicial system. She'd never allowed cameras in her courtroom, never permitted disruptions, never bent the rules for anyone, not for celebrities, not for politicians, not for crying children or grieving families. But Emma Rodriguez wasn't just anyone. She was a 7-year-old girl who had watched her father die, who held the key to justice in her traumatized silence, and who might never find her voice again without the golden retriever who had become her bridge to the world. Williams looked up at the owl. 2 attorneys, her decision forming like storm clouds in her mind. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 decades of legal experience and the unexpected compassion of a woman who had never forgotten that justice was supposed to be about more than just following rules. Gentlemen, she said quietly, sometimes the law must evolve to serve justice, not the other way around. The Iron Lady was about to make legal history. The media circus surrounding the Emma Rodriguez case had transformed the normally quiet King County Superior Court into something resembling a Hollywood premiere. Television news trucks lined 4th Avenue like an invasion force, their satellite. Dishes reaching toward the gray Seattle sky like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. CNN, Fox News, NBC, and every local station from Vancouver to Portland had dispatched their most experienced court reporters, sensing that this case would either make history or become a cautionary tale about the American justice system gone wrong. This is Anderson Cooper 360, and tonight we're following the unprecedented case of 7-year-old Emma Rodriguez, who may become the youngest witness in Washington state history to testify with a therapy animal by her side, the silver-haired anchor announced to millions of viewers. The story had captured national attention, not just for its legal implications, but for the profound human drama at its center: a little girl, her dog, and the quest for justice that was challenging everything courts thought they knew about trauma. And testimony. Inside Courtroom 5A, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Judge Patricia Williams had arrived that morning to find her normally spacious courtroom packed beyond capacity. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations in at least 4 languages, as reporters, legal observers, victims' rights advocates, and curious citizens filled every available seat. Court security had been doubled, and metal detectors processed. A steady stream of people hoping to witness what many were calling the most important child testimony case of the decade. Emma Rodriguez sat in the witness preparation room adjacent to the courtroom, completely unaware of the media storm swirling around her case. She wore her best dress, a navy blue one with tiny white flowers that her father had bought her for last Christmas, and her long dark hair had been carefully braided by her mother that morning. But her small hands shook as she gripped Buddy's leash with white knuckles, and her eyes darted nervously toward the door every time footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Maria Rodriguez paced the small room like a caged animal, her rosary beads clicking softly as she whispered prayers in Spanish. She had taken unpaid leave from the hospital to be present for Emma's testimony, a financial sacrifice that would mean rice and beans for dinner for the next 2 months. But nothing, not poverty, not fear, not the intimidating circus outside, would keep her from supporting her daughter through this ordeal. Buddy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The golden retriever, normally playful and energetic, sat perfectly still beside Emma's chair, his intelligent brown eyes alert and focused. Tom Bradley, the retired police officer who had been working with Buddy as an unofficial therapy dog trainer, had spent weeks preparing both dog and child for this moment. Buddy had been trained to remain calm in crowds, to ignore distractions, and most importantly, to provide Emma with the emotional anchor she needed to function in high-stress situations. "Remember what we practiced, Emma," Dr. Rebecca Foster said, gently kneeling beside the little girl's chair. The child psychologist had worked with Emma for months, using art therapy, play therapy, and gradual exposure techniques to prepare her for this day. "Buddy will be right there with you. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say. And if you need a break, just look at Judge Williams, and she'll help you." But Emma's face remained pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the wall. She hadn't spoken during the morning preparation session, communicating only through small nods and the occasional squeeze of Buddy's fur when Dr. Foster asked yes or no questions. In the courtroom proper, Marcus Thompson sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting gray suit provided by the county. The 34-year-old career criminal looked smaller than his arrest photo suggested, his hollow cheeks and sunken eyes betraying years of drug abuse and hard living. But there was something unsettling about the way his gaze kept drifting toward the witness preparation room door, as if he could sense his accuser's presence through the walls. Thompson's public defender, Sarah Morrison, had fought this case with surprising tenacity. The 28-year-old attorney was fresh out of law school with massive student debt and an idealistic belief in the presumption of innocence. She genuinely believed that the justice system's willingness to bend rules for a sympathetic witness set a dangerous precedent, regardless of how heartbreaking Emma's situation might be. "Your Honor," Morrison had argued that morning, "we're essentially asking a jury to convict my client based on the testimony of a child who hasn't spoken in months and requires an emotional support animal to function. How can we possibly ensure a fair trial under these circumstances?" But prosecutor Linda Chon had prepared for this moment with the thoroughness of a general planning a crucial battle. She had consulted with child development experts from across the country, reviewed every legal precedent involving child witnesses, and even brought in a specialist in canine therapy from the University of California to testify about the psychological benefits of animal-assisted testimony. As the clock approached 2 p.m., the scheduled time for Emma's testimony, the courtroom fell into an expectant hush. Judge Williams took her place behind the bench with characteristic dignity, but those who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was fully aware of the historic nature of what was about to unfold. The bailiff's voice rang out across the packed courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Williams." But before the formal proceedings could begin, a soft knock at the witness room door announced that the moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading had finally arrived. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, clutching the leash of a golden retriever, named Buddy, was about to walk into American legal history. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a single shaft of February sunlight broke through the Seattle clouds, streaming through the tall courtroom windows like a spotlight waiting for its star performer. The stage was set, the audience was ready, and somewhere in the witness preparation room, a little girl was about to discover whether she had the courage to speak truth to power. The circus was about to become a cathedral of justice. The heavy oak door of the witness preparation room creaked open with the weight of destiny. Emma Rodriguez stood frozen in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor behind her. The navy dress, her father had chosen for her last Christmas seemed to hang loose on her diminished form, and her face had the pale, translucent quality of someone who had seen too much and slept too little. Beside her, Buddy pressed close against her legs, his golden coat gleaming under the courtroom's chandeliers, his intelligent eyes scanning the sea of faces that had turned to watch their entrance. Courtroom that had buzzed with conversation, just moments before, fell into a silence so profound that the soft padding of Buddy's paws on the marble floor sounded like thunder. 300 pairs of eyes followed Emma's painfully slow progress down the center aisle. Reporters leaned forward, in their seats, their pens poised above notepads. Court officers straightened their uniforms unconsciously. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keys as if she understood that history was about to unfold in ways that might be difficult to capture in mere words. Judge Patricia Williams watched from her elevated bench, her hands folded carefully on the mahogany surface before her. In 30 years of presiding over criminal cases, she had seen witnesses collapse under cross-examination, defendants confess in dramatic courtroom breakdowns, and attorneys deliver closing arguments that moved hardened criminals to tears. She had never seen anything quite like the sight of this tiny girl walking toward the witness stand with a golden retriever as her only source of courage. Marcus Thompson, seated at the defense table just 30 feet away, seemed to shrink into his chair as Emma approached. His hollow eyes, which had stared down armed robbery victims and intimidated fellow inmates, couldn't quite meet the gaze of the 7-year-old whose father he had murdered. His court-appointed attorney, Sarah Morrison, placed a restraining hand on his arm as his leg began to bounce nervously under the table. Even hardened criminals, it seemed, found something unsettling about the prospect of facing a child witness. Emma's mother, Maria, sat in the front row of the gallery, her knuckles white as she gripped the back of the wooden bench. She had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch since the murder, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story of a woman haunted by nightmares and consumed by the terrible responsibility of seeking justice for her husband while protecting her traumatized daughter. Her lips moved silently in prayer, the same prayer she had whispered every morning for 3 months. Por favor, Dios, give my baby the strength to find her voice. Prosecutor Linda Chun rose from behind the prosecution table, her expression carefully neutral, but her heart racing. She had staked her career on this moment, arguing passionately before Judge Williams that Emma's testimony was not only legally admissible, but morally essential. The physical evidence against Thompson was strong, but without Emma's eyewitness account, reasonable doubt might be enough to set a killer free. Chun had prepared for this testimony with the thoroughness of a surgeon, planning a delicate operation. But she knew that no amount of preparation could account for the unpredictable psychology of a traumatized child. The state calls Emma Rodriguez to the witness stand, Chun announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. Emma took 3 more steps forward, then stopped completely. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and a fine sheen of perspiration appeared on her forehead, despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning. The witness stand, elevated and imposing, seemed to loom before her like a mountain she lacked the strength to climb. The judge's kindly face felt impossibly far away. The jury box, filled with 12 strangers, who would decide whether justice would be served for her father, might as well have been on another planet. Buddy, sensing Emma's distress with the intuitive precision that had made golden retrievers, legendary therapy companions, positioned himself directly in front of her. His warm brown eyes met hers with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding. The courtroom held its collective breath as seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, in a moment that would be replayed on news programs across the nation, Emma slowly sank to her knees on the marble floor and pressed her face against Buddy's neck. Her lips moved against his golden fur, and though the courtroom remained silent, Her words were audible only to the dog who had shared every moment of her trauma and recovery. "I'm scared, boy," she whispered so softly that the court stenographer couldn't record it. "I can see the bad man. I can see Daddy falling down again. Help me be brave like Daddy was. Help me tell them what really happened that night." Buddy's response was immediate and profound. His tail wagged once, a single deliberate movement that seemed to carry the weight of an ancient promise between species. He lifted his massive head and touched his nose to Emma's cheek with infinite gentleness, as if transferring some essential courage from his canine heart to our frightened human one. The golden retriever then did something extraordinary. He turned toward the witness stand and took a single step forward, looking back at Emma with unmistakable invitation. His message was clear. "We'll do this together, you and me, just like everything else." Emma slowly rose to her feet, her hand finding its familiar place on Buddy's collar. Her legs trembled, but she began to walk forward again, each step synchronized with her four-legged guardian's steady pace. The courtroom remained frozen in respectful silence as the unlikely pair approached the witness stand, a traumatized little girl and a golden retriever who had somehow become her voice, her courage, and her bridge back to the world of the living. Judge Williams leaned forward slightly, her stern judicial demeanor softening into something approaching maternal concern. When Emma finally reached the witness stand, the judge spoke in a voice so gentle it seemed to transform the imposing courtroom into something resembling a grandmother's living room. "Hello, Emma," she said softly. "I'm Judge Williams, and I'm very proud of how brave you're being today. Can you tell us your name?" Emma looked up at the judge, then down at Buddy, then across the courtroom at her mother's encouraging face. Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time in 3 months, Emma Rodriguez prepared to speak. Emma's voice emerged like a whisper of wind through autumn leaves, so quiet that Judge Williams had to lean forward to catch her words. But those two simple syllables, Emma Rodriguez, spoken in the trembling voice of a 7-year-old girl who hadn't uttered a sound in 3 months, reverberated through the packed courtroom with the power of thunder. "Thank you, Emma," Judge Williams said, her own voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel. "You're doing wonderfully. Now, I want you to know that you can take all the time you need to answer any questions. And if you feel scared, need a break, you just tell me, okay?" Emma nodded, her small hand buried deep in Buddy's golden fur. The retriever had positioned himself directly beside the witness chair, close enough that Emma could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her leg. His presence seemed to create an invisible shield around her, transforming the intimidating courtroom into something more manageable, more human. Prosecutor Linda Chun approached with the careful movements of someone approaching a frightened wild animal. She had rehearsed this moment hundreds of times, but nothing could have prepared her for the actual experience of questioning a child who had witnessed her father's murder. Every word had to be chosen with surgical precision, too gentle, and the testimony might lack the legal weight needed for conviction. Too aggressive, and Emma might retreat back into her protective silence. "Emma, do you remember the night when something scary happened at your house?" Chun asked, her voice warm but clear enough for the jury to hear every word. Emma's grip tightened on Buddy's collar, and the dog seemed to sense her distress. He shifted slightly, pressing closer against her legs in a gesture that was both protective and reassuring. The courtroom held its collective breath as Emma's dark eyes darted from Chun to the jury to her mother in the gallery, finally settling on Buddy's patient brown gaze. "Yes," Emma whispered, the single word carrying the weight of 3 months of nightmares, sleepless nights, and silent screams. "Can you tell us what you were doing before the scary thing happened?" Chun continued, establishing the timeline that would be crucial for the jury's understanding. Emma's voice grew slightly stronger. though she never lifted her eyes from Buddy's reassuring presence. I was coloring Belle's dress yellow, like Daddy's. Sunflowers in the garden. And Buddy was sleeping next to me, but then he got scared and stood up because something was wrong. The detail was remarkable. Defense attorney Sarah Morrison leaned forward, taking notes rapidly. Even she had to admit that Emma's recall was extraordinarily precise for someone so young and traumatized. The prosecution had been right about one thing: this child remembered everything with crystal clarity. "What happened next, Emma?" Sean asked gently. Daddy was making spaghetti in the kitchen. The kind with the little shells, because those are my favorite. He was singing the song about the butterfly that Abuela taught him. Emma's voice cracked slightly on the word, Abuela, and she bent down to press her face against Buddy's neck for a moment before continuing. Then the window went crash, and there was glass everywhere, and Buddy started growling. Marcus Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face pale as Emma's testimony began to paint a vivid picture of that terrible night. His attorney placed a warning hand on his arm, but Thompson seemed unable to look away from the small witness, whose words were systematically destroying any hope of acquittal. "Did you see who broke the window, Emma?" Chun asked, approaching the critical moment of identification. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her hands trembled as she gripped Buddy's fur, and for a moment it seemed she might retreat back into silence. But the golden retriever seemed to understand exactly what was needed. He lifted his head and looked directly at Emma, his tail wagging. Once in that familiar gesture of encouragement that had carried her through months of therapy and nightmares. "Yes," Emma said, her voice gaining strength from some deep well of courage that even she didn't know she possessed. "It was the man with the scary eyes. He had a black mask, but I could see his eyes, and they were angry and mean. He yelled at Daddy about money, but Daddy said we didn't have any money. We just had love and spaghetti in each other." The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Reporters scribbled frantically, but their pens seemed muted by the profound silence that had settled over the room. Even the court officers, used to maintaining professional detachment, found themselves leaning forward to catch every word. "What did the man do then, Emma?" Sean asked, though her heart was breaking for the child who would have to relive her worst nightmare in front of 300 strangers. Emma closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, they were filled with tears that had been waiting 3 months to fall. He pointed a gun at Daddy, and Daddy said, "Please don't hurt my little girl. She's all I have." But the man didn't care. He made 3 loud noises: bang, 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 and Daddy fell down, and there was red everywhere. The tears came freely, now streaming down Emma's cheeks as she finally spoke the words that had been trapped inside her for so long. "I ran to Daddy, but he couldn't talk anymore. His eyes were open, but he couldn't see me. And Buddy came too, and we stayed with Daddy until the police came with the loud sirens." Maria Rodriguez was openly weeping in the gallery, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. Several jurors wiped away tears, and even Judge Williams had to pause to compose herself. "Emma," Chun said, very gently, "do you see that man, the one who hurt your daddy here in this courtroom today?" The moment had arrived. Emma looked up from Buddy's protective presence and scanned the courtroom with eyes that seemed far older than her 7 years. Her gaze moved past the lawyers, past the jury, past the packed gallery, and finally settled on the defense table where Marcus Thompson sat frozen under the weight of a child's unflinching stare. Emma raised her small hand and pointed directly at him. "That's him," she said in a voice that carried across the silent courtroom like a verdict from heaven itself. "That's the man who killed my daddy." The jury deliberation room had never felt smaller to the 12 men and women who held Marcus Thompson's fate in their hands. For 3 hours, they had pored over evidence, debated legal technicalities, and wrestled with the profound responsibility of convicting a man based largely on the testimony of a 7-year-old girl and her golden retriever. The walls seemed to close in as they examined crime scene photos, reviewed Emma's heartbreaking drawings, and replayed in their minds the moment when she pointed directly at Thompson with unwavering certainty. Juror number 7, Margaret Shawnaa, retired elementary school teacher with 30 years of experience reading children, had been the first to speak when deliberations began. "I've worked with thousands of children," she told her fellow jurors, "and that little girl was telling the absolute truth. Children don't lie about trauma like that, especially not with such specific details." But juror number 3, David Williams, a construction foreman with a healthy skepticism of the justice system, had pushed back. "Look, my heart breaks for that kid, but we're talking about sending a man to prison for life based on the word of a traumatized child who hasn't spoken in months. What if her memory is distorted? What if the therapy sessions influenced what she remembers?" The debate had continued for hours, with emotions running high on both sides. Juror number 9, Sarah Martinez, a social worker who specialized in child abuse cases, had spread Emma's drawings across the conference table like pieces of a tragic puzzle. "These drawings are consistent with genuine trauma recall," she explained to the others. "Look at the details, the position of broken glass, the exact layout of the room, even the Nike swoosh on the perpetrator's shoes. This isn't imagination or suggestion. This is memory." Meanwhile, in the courthouse corridor, Emma Rodriguez sat on a wooden bench with her legs dangling, not quite able to reach the floor. Buddy lay beside her, his head resting on her small lap while she absent-mindedly stroked his golden ears. The testimony had drained her completely, but something had shifted inside her during those terrifying minutes on the witness stand. The words that had been trapped in her throat for 3 months had finally escaped, and with them had gone some of the crushing weight that had been suffocating her spirit. "Mia, you were so brave," her mother Maria whispered, sitting beside her daughter and pulling her close. "Daddy would be so proud of you." For the first time since the murder, Emma leaned into her mother's embrace without flinching, allowing herself to be comforted in a way she hadn't been able to accept during the darkest months of her grief. Dr. Rebecca Foster observed this reunion from across the hallway, making notes in her case file. The breakthrough that Emma had experienced on the witness stand was more significant than anyone realized. By finding the courage to speak her truth in the most intimidating possible circumstances, she had begun the long process of reclaiming her voice and her power from the trauma that had stolen both. Sarah Martinez paced the hallway outside the courtroom, her 20 years of police experience telling her that the case was strong, but never guaranteed. She had seen guilty defendants walk free on technicalities and innocent people convicted on circumstantial evidence. The American justice system was imperfect, but it was all they had, and today it would either vindicate a murdered father or fail his traumatized daughter in the most public way possible. Inside the jury room, the tide had finally turned. Juror number 12, an accountant named Robert Hayes, had been examining the timeline of Thompson's whereabouts on the night of the murder. "The physical evidence supports everything the child said," he announced to his colleagues. Thompson's fingerprints on the window frame, his DNA on the glass shards, his parole officer's testimony that he missed check-in that evening. It all corroborates her testimony perfectly. The foreman, a retired judge named Patricia Williams, called for the final vote. One by one, 12 hands were raised in unanimous agreement. Marcus Thompson was guilty of murder in the first degree. When the jury filed back into the packed courtroom, the silence was so complete that the soft clicking of the court reporter's keys sounded like gunshots. Judge Williams, her face a mask of judicial composure, that barely concealed her own emotional investment in the case, asked the question that would determine whether justice had truly been served. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood, his voice steady despite the enormous weight of the moment. We have, Your Honor, in the matter of the State of Washington versus Marcus Thompson, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a way that Judge Williams had never experienced in 30 years on the bench. Emma's family wept openly, their sobs of relief mixing with applause from the gallery. Reporters frantically typed updates that would flash across news screens within minutes. Victims' rights advocates embraced each other in vindication of their long fight for justice. But in the center of it all, Emma Rodriguez simply looked up at her mother with eyes that sparkled with something that had been missing for 3 months' hope. She had done it. She had found her voice, faced her nightmare, and helped ensure that the man who had destroyed her family would never hurt anyone else again. Marcus Thompson showed no emotion as he was led away in shackles, but his hollow eyes seemed to carry the weight of a little girl's unwavering courage. He had underestimated Emma Rodriguez, assuming that trauma would silence her forever. He had been catastrophically wrong. Judge Williams raised her gavel one final time, bringing order to the emotional chaos of the courtroom. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 3 decades of judicial experience, but also the warmth of a woman who had witnessed something extraordinary. Mr. Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell with finality, but Williams wasn't finished. Looking directly at Emma, who was now standing beside her mother with Buddy at her side, the judge smiled with genuine warmth. Miss Rodriguez, your courage today has not only brought justice for your father, but has shown this entire courtroom and this entire nation what it means to find strength in the most impossible circumstances. You and Buddy have changed the course of legal history, and you should be very proud. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Emma Rodriguez walked hand in hand with her mother toward the door, Buddy trotting faithfully beside them. The little girl, who had entered the courthouse in silence, was leaving with her voice restored, her courage proven, and her father's memory honored. Justice finally had been served. 2.5 years after that historic day, in courtroom 5A, Emma Rodriguez stood at the podium in the marble-columned Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C., her hand resting confidently on Buddy's head as she gazed out at an audience. That included senators, congressmen, victims' rights advocates, and representatives from children's organizations across the nation. At 9 years old, she had become the youngest person in American history to address a congressional hearing on judicial reform, and her presence commanded the room with a quiet authority that would have been unimaginable during her months of traumatic silence. The transformation was remarkable. Emma's once pale cheeks now glowed with health and confidence. Her dark hair cascaded in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a navy blazer that her mother had saved for months to buy, the same color as the dress she'd worn to testify against her father's killer. But most striking of all was her voice. Clear, strong, and filled with the kind of conviction that only comes from surviving the unthinkable and emerging stronger on the other side. Buddy, now 4 years old and officially certified as a courthouse therapy dog, wore a special service vest adorned with patches from police departments across the country. His golden coat had developed distinguished silvering around his muzzle, and his brown eyes held the wise, patient expression of a dog who had witnessed miracles and understood his role in creating them. In the 2 years since the trial, Buddy had accompanied 17 child witnesses in 12 different states, helping traumatized children find their voices in courtrooms from Seattle to Miami. Honorable senators and representatives, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room without any trace of the tremor that had once made every word a struggle. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and this is Buddy, We're here today to talk about something very important: how we can help other kids like me find the courage to tell their stories when bad things happen to people they love. The audience was captivated. Senator Patricia Murray of Washington State, who had sponsored the federal legislation that would become known as Emma's Law, leaned forward with visible emotion. Beside her, Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal justice, found himself wiping away tears as Emma continued her testimony. 2 years ago, I couldn't talk at all because I was too scared. I saw something terrible happen to my daddy, and the fear made my voice disappear completely. But Buddy helped me find it again, and together we told a judge and jury the truth about what we saw. Because of that, the bad man who hurt my daddy can never hurt anyone else again. In the gallery behind Emma, Maria Rodriguez beamed with pride. That seemed to radiate from every pore. The single mother had worked 3 jobs for the past year to support Emma's therapy, education, and their frequent travels to speak at conferences and court hearings across the country. The financial sacrifice had been enormous, but watching her daughter transform from a traumatized, silent child into a confident young advocate made every missed meal and sleepless night worthwhile. Dr. Rebecca Foster, now recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in childhood trauma recovery, sat in the second row taking detailed notes. Emma's case had revolutionized her understanding of the therapeutic relationship between children and animals, leading to groundbreaking research that was changing how courts across America approached child witnesses. The little girl who had once communicated only through drawings and whispered fears had become the catalyst for a complete transformation in juvenile justice procedures. Since our trial in Seattle, Emma continued, consulting notes she had written in her careful 9-year-old handwriting, 43 states have passed laws allowing therapy animals to support child witnesses in courtrooms. Buddy and I have helped 17 other kids tell their stories, and every single one of them found the courage to speak the truth. Some of them were scared of people who hurt them, just like I was. Others saw car accidents or other scary things. But all of them needed a friend with 4 paws and a big heart to help them be brave. Judge Patricia Williams, who had flown in from Seattle specifically to witness Emma's congressional testimony, felt her throat tighten with emotion as she remembered the day in her courtroom when she had made the controversial decision to allow an unprecedented breach of legal protocol. The Iron Lady had faced fierce criticism from legal traditionalists, but watching Emma's transformation had validated her belief that justice sometimes required courage as much as it required law books. Hearing room erupted in sustained applause as Emma concluded her prepared remarks, but she wasn't finished. Looking directly into the C-SPAN cameras that were broadcasting her words to millions of Americans, she spoke with the clarity of someone who had stared into the abyss and emerged with unshakable wisdom. Some grown-ups think kids can't handle big, scary things, she said, her hand never leaving Buddy's head. But they're wrong. Kids are braver than anyone thinks. We just need someone to believe in us and help us find our voices. And sometimes that someone has 4 paws, a wet nose, and a heart big enough to hold our fears until we're strong enough to let them go. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 5 minutes, with senators and representatives openly weeping as they applauded. But Emma's attention was focused on the dozens of children in the gallery, kids who had been flown in from across the country to witness this historic moment, many of them accompanied by their own therapy animals and preparing to testify in their own cases. 6 months later, President Biden signed Emma's Law into federal legislation, requiring all federal courts to accommodate therapy animals for child witnesses and providing funding for training programs across the nation. Emma was invited to the White House for the signing ceremony, where she stood beside the president as he used 12 different pens to sign the bill that would forever change how America's courts treat its youngest and most vulnerable witnesses. Today, Emma Rodriguez is 11 years old and in 6th grade at Roosevelt Elementary in Seattle, where she maintains straight A's and has started a club called Buddy's Friends to help other children deal with trauma and loss. She still sees Dr. Foster once a month, not because she needs therapy anymore, but because she has become a valuable consultant in the treatment of other traumatized children. Buddy, now 6 years old and a certified therapy dog instructor, spends his retirement training younger dogs to follow in his paw prints. Together, they have created a legacy that extends far beyond a single courthouse in Seattle. They have proven that courage comes in all shapes and sizes, that justice sometimes requires breaking rules, and that the smallest voices can change the world when they finally find the strength to speak. Marcus Thompson remains in solitary confinement at the Washington State Penitentiary, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He has never granted an interview about the case, but prison guards report that he keeps newspaper clippings about Emma's law in his cell, daily reminder of how catastrophically he underestimated the little girl whose voice he tried to silence. Forever. Emma Rodriguez and Buddy had not just survived their nightmare. They had transformed it into hope for thousands of other children who needed to know that their voices mattered, their truth had power, and somewhere in the world, a golden retriever named Buddy had proven that the best kind of courage often comes with 4 paws and an unshakable belief that every child deserves to be heard.